Hello and welcome to Painting with Rob Boss. Today we're going to be drawing a skull in charcoal. You will need a 12 by 9 sheet of drawing paper, a piece of soft vine charcoal, maybe a couple of those, a blending tool of some sort. It could be a stump, a brush, a Q-tip, a Kleenex, a kneaded eraser, and a charcoal pencil. Okay, so let's go over what we're going to be needing today. You're going to want a ruler, like this. You're going to want a piece of vine charcoal. You might want a couple of them. You're going to want a charcoal pencil. You're going to want a kneaded eraser. And you're going to want something for blending. You can use tortillon, you can use a Q-tip, you can use a brush. You can even use a Kleenex. Alright, so we're going to start off today by laying out some triangles to help us break the image up. So for this to work, it's really important that the paper we're drawing on or the space we're drawing in be proportional to our reference image. So I'll show you how to do that in a second. What I'm going to do right now, though, is I'm going to make a mark on the reference image halfway between the top and the bottom. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So this is an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, so I'm putting it at the 5.5 inch mark. And now I'm going to do the same thing, dividing this. This is 8.5 inches wide, so I'm going to do it at 4.25. And I'll flip it over, and I'll do 4.25 again. Alright, so now what we want to do is draw a line down the middle of the paper here. So this is going to kind of divide the paper vertically. And we want to do the same thing going horizontally. So now we've got 4 rectangles. So we divide the paper up in order to make drawing easier. You're dealing with smaller chunks of the drawing. Here we're going to use boxes and triangles. So I'm actually going to draw from the corner of the paper itself, not from the corner of the image. And I'm going to go straight through the center of the intersection I made earlier. So this will divide those 4 boxes into 8 triangles, making it even smaller. So this method works really well because you don't have to measure really. But you do have to have 2 proportional spaces you're working in. So your reference image has to be proportional to your drawing area. So we're going to do a little trick to facilitate that in just a second. But for now, I'm going to finish up my triangles here. So I basically got a long diagonal going through from corner to corner, or 2 long diagonals, and then lines dividing it in half horizontally and vertically. So to make our drawing space the same size as the image, I'm just going to lay the image down on the drawing paper, and I'm just going to trace around the perimeter there. And then our drawing space will be the same size as our image. It doesn't have to be perfect, but you want it pretty close. And there we go. Now I'm just going to repeat that same process of drawing in the boxes and then the triangles on my actual drawing. You want to make sure you use Vine charcoal for this. The Vine charcoal will erase really easily, and we want to be able to erase these guidelines after we're done. The charcoal pencil, on the other hand, is really hard to erase. So if you use the charcoal pencil to lay out your triangles, it's going to be really hard to get rid of that later. We don't want to use the charcoal pencil in this drawing until the very, very end. Alright, so same idea here. I'm just marking halfway through this line in order to make a horizontal and vertical bisecting lines. So that'd be 5.5 on the long sides and 4.25 on the short sides. So right here it looks a little weird to me, and that's because I measured incorrectly. So if something looks weird, if it doesn't quite look horizontal, give it a double check. It's really easy to make mistakes measuring. At least for me it is. Some of you might be perfect measurers, but not me. So I got to double check these things. I'm actually going to check this side too. And I have that in a bad spot as well. So now that both of those are corrected, we should be able to proceed. Alright, so now I'm going to draw this line. So now I've got my 4 boxes. I'm going to further divide that with some diagonal lines. So I'm going from the corner of the box I drew this time to the center point. And that should give me 2 big diagonals going all the way through the drawing surface, and then a vertical line and a horizontal line also dividing up that space. And there we go. We're ready to draw. Alright, so you can pause now and get caught up to here, and then we'll be moving on with the actual drawing process. Alright, so our first step here is going to be to lay in our sketch. So we can actually cheat a little bit since these are the same size. I'm actually going to measure how far down the top of the skull is along that center line and make a little mark. Same thing with the diagonal line. I'm going to measure how far it is. Now I'm not measuring from the corner, which I should be. I forgot to do that. But you, when you do it, measure from the corner of your picture and then the corner of the rectangle you drew on your drawing paper. So mine's going to be a little bit off. But if you measure from the actual corner of the paper rather than the edge of the image, you should get a more accurate measurement there than I got. Alright, so I'm taking some measurements and kind of marking where the perimeter of the skull is. So I'm kind of just trying to figure out my outline. And you can measure along each line to get a more accurate placement. Now, if your drawing isn't the same size as the picture, it doesn't work the same way. But if you're drawing something in exactly the same size, you can use this technique to help you draw a little bit more accurately and get your initial placement a little more correct. You can also further divide up your triangles if you want to break up the space even more by connecting the opposite corners in each of the 4 boxes and making another set of diagonals that'll basically break it up from 8 triangles to 16 triangles, and then you've got even smaller fragments to work with. So I just continue around on each line, measuring where the intersection of the skull is with the guideline there. I'm writing down the measurements for you. Like I said, mine are a little bit off because I only measured to the edge of the photo, and I should have measured to the edge of the paper. So don't necessarily use my measurements. You probably want to take your own. All right, now I'm going to start to sketch in that skull. So I want to pay attention to where the skull's outline intersects with the lines and the spaces that I marked each spot. But I also want to look at the lines and curves that are in between those. So this makes it a little simpler because instead of having to draw the whole thing, I'm just having to get from point A to point B. And I know where both of those points are, and I just have to pay attention to how I get there. Got a little drop down, then it comes in a little bit, and then I got another little drop. Then I've got the teeth that kind of pooch out to connect where I marked the intersection there. All right, so I'm going to speed up this phase a little bit so you can still see what's going on, and then you can pause for a little bit if you need to once you get to the end. All right, so I'm just kind of working through, trying to hit all of the intersections that I marked earlier, and I'm just kind of sketching out basic guidelines for where I want to get to, and just kind of marks for how I want to lay out all of my shading. So it's just kind of breaking the drawing down into different shapes. I don't need to worry too much about getting any specific edges. It's just marking things that I want to have reference to later. We're going to be fully shading this whole drawing and trying to make most of the lines go away. So these aren't necessarily going to be final marks, but they're kind of going to mark the important edges and locations and spots in the drawing as I go along. All right, so it doesn't have to be perfect this time, and it doesn't have to necessarily look exactly like the skull when I finish. I just want to have marks down of important kind of delineations between values or important edges in the image. Pause the video if you need to and go ahead and try to get the image to this point here. All right, once we've got a decent sketch laid out, our next step is going to be to add all of the shadow. So I want to look at my image here and decide where the shadows are. If I'm thinking about things on like a 5-point value scale, the shadow is going to be anything that's a 4 or a 5. And then my highlights and halftones and all the rest of that will be anything that's in the light really, will be anything that's like a 3 to a 1. So I'm going to shade in these eye sockets, definitely. I'm going to shade in the nose socket. I'm going to shade in the little black opening at the side of the mouth there. And I'm going to shade in some shadow underneath the cheeks on my left side of the chin, under the eyes, and the side of the head a little bit. So I just want to block everything in with one flat shadow and then smooth it out using my smoothing or blending tool. Okay? So I want to have like a nice dark unified shadow in the end. I don't want to have a lot of differentiation between value. I want to take everything to about a 4. And we will add some darker touches to the shadows later on. But for now, we just want a unified flat shadow. All of it at about a 4 on a 5 tone value scale. All right, so it can be useful to kind of mark the edges of the shadows and then shade things in. That's kind of a useful way to do it. Another useful thing to do in this phase while you're trying to divide the shadow and light areas is to squint a little bit at your subject. Just kind of squint your eyes, and that'll simplify the shapes. That'll kind of show you the separation of the light and shadow areas. We want to block all the shadows in completely. So don't be afraid of those kind of lighter shadow areas. Go ahead and block those in fully. All right, so I'm speeding this up a little bit. The goal is to just kind of block in all of the shadows here. So you can use the side of your charcoal if you're doing big areas. For this, most of the shadows are kind of tight, so I'm just using the tip. And again, if I kind of squint to simplify the image, all of that shadow blocks together. And that's kind of what I'm going for here, is just big blocks of shadow. So anything that is not being hit directly by the light or has a particularly dark value, I do want to shade in this phase. We should almost get like a completely black and white image without any gray. That's a very simplified version of what we're looking at the end of this process here. Once you get all the shadows laid in, you want to go in and kind of smooth them out, blend them together with a blending tool, and try to unify those shadows a little bit. So a lot of this is going to be about kind of unifying things and then differentiating them. So later on we'll add some more details and some additional value to some of the shadow areas to differentiate between those lighter darks and those really dark darks. But for now, just kind of smooth everything out. So you can do this with a tortillon. That's the usual tool we use. You can also use a Q-tip. These are really nice because they're very cheap. They don't have as much of a detailed point as the tortillon, but they are super inexpensive. You can buy them in bulk. You could use one for each color if you're doing pastels. You can also use the brush. The brush is kind of nice because it's good practice for painting and learning how to kind of move pigment around with a brush for later on. Alright, after you block in all the shadows, it should look more or less like this. You can pause the video here for a little bit and get caught up. Okay, so now we get to the sort of longest step in this process, which is going to be adding in your halftones, your lights, and your highlights. So what I like to do for this is to kind of drag pigment out of the shadow areas to kind of get a little bit of pigment on all of the sort of lighter tones in here. So our highlights are going to be the ones on our value scale, and those are probably going to be bare paper. So we don't necessarily want to drag any pigment onto the actual highlight areas, but our lights and our halftones are going to be 2s and 3s on the 5 value scale. So for those, we can drag a little bit of pigment out of the shadows and blend it with the blending stump. We can also add a little bit of pigment as needed using our Vine charcoal. For this, we usually use kind of a hatching motion. You don't want to get a ton of charcoal on there. You don't want it to be as dark as your shadows. So you use kind of a hatching motion, just kind of drawing parallel lines and then blending them all together to get the value you're looking for. So we're going to kind of slowly and systematically work our way through the drawing, adding pigment where needed and then blending it into the paper, or pulling the pigment from a dark area towards a lighter area. We can also shape our highlights or lighten areas using our kneaded eraser. The kneaded eraser can be kneaded. This has 2 benefits to it. One, when you knead the eraser, it will clean it up. The second benefit is that you can sculpt the eraser into like a point. So if you had to do a fine highlight like we see like right at the bottom edge of the large eye socket there, where we've got a thin highlight sort of running along the bone, you could make sort of a little point on your kneaded eraser and pull that highlight out. So I'm going to speed this up, but you can kind of watch me go through that process. I'm just kind of pulling pigment away from dark areas, adding a little bit with my Vine charcoal sometimes, and then when I need to back off and make an area lighter, I will use my kneaded eraser. If your blending tool is kind of dirty, you can use it for a drawing tool and kind of pull pigment around. Be conscious of that though if you don't want to pull that pigment, so be aware of how much pigment you have on there. Here I'm using kind of a cross hatching. I'm going to blend that in for kind of a mid-tone. Alright, so I'll speed this up and I'll talk about anything interesting I see as I go through, and then you'll have a little time to pause and catch up after this step. Alright, so I'm sort of slowly working my way through. You want to pull from like all of your shadow pools a little bit of pigment out. Usually you'll have a subtle transition. And we just want to try to analyze each area. So a good way to think about it is after your shadows, you're going to think about everywhere that's kind of a 3 on a 5-tone value scale. So anywhere that's a middle tone. And make sure that you get pigment onto that. And you can either pull that with your blending stump from your shadow, or you can add a little bit using your Vine charcoal. You want to do that softly with kind of a gentle hand so that you don't get it as dark as your shadow, but you can add it directly. I'm also going in as I work through this and adding in my background as well. So it's a good time to start working on that. You kind of want to work the whole drawing at once. The background doesn't necessarily need to be as detailed as the skull itself, so take that into consideration as you add that in. If you need to lighten anywhere, after you do your 3 values on your value scale, your kind of midtones, then you're going to move on to your lights. So these are the areas that are not quite a midtone, they're a little lighter than that. So maybe like right to the left of the middle line on the forehead, there's an area that's kind of a little bit dark, but it's not as dark as the midtones. So areas like that, you just add a little bit of pigment and kind of blend that in. Any areas where there's a highlight, like that kind of shiny spot on the dome right there, you might want to pull out using your kneaded eraser and try to get those as light as you can. So the kneaded eraser can be kind of squished into a point and used as a kind of almost reverse drawing tool. That's a really handy way to use it. But you're just going to gradually work until all of the values look correct. Now we don't want to worry about details right now. We're going to do details last. So we're going to use our charcoal pencil for the details and the super dark darks. But for now, we're just trying to get all those values in correctly. So yeah, I think that's the basic gist of what we're doing here. All right, so I just kind of continue to work, adding a little pigment here and there. You can see I use kind of a hatching motion, which means parallel lines instead of shading the whole thing. I'm also pulling highlights back out with my kneaded eraser. All right, so you can go ahead and pause here and get all caught up to this point. We don't want to worry about any of the details, but we want to get the tones all set except for our darkest values. All right, the last phase here is going to be to add in detail and very dark darks using our charcoal pencil. If you need to, you can sharpen your charcoal pencil using a piece of sandpaper like this. That's how you can get a finer point on there. They are difficult to sharpen with a regular pencil sharpener because the charcoal tends to snap and break pretty easily. So you can use a piece of sandpaper to kind of sand it down into a point as needed. With these charcoal pencils, you also, they're wrapped in paper. You can pull the paper off by pulling the string down a little bit and then unwrapping the paper and get a little more charcoal point out there. A lot of artists like to draw with a fairly lengthy bit of charcoal extended. So the idea here is to add in all of the darkest darks. The charcoal pencil will be a little bit darker than your vine charcoal, so you can get in these extra dark shadows like we see in the eye sockets, like we see in the nose sockets, like we see in the back of the mouth there. It also gives you a fine line, so it's good for adding additional details like the cracks, the dark shadows and gaps around the teeth, things of that nature. So we're just going to go back through the entire drawing here, look for details we need to add, and look for dark areas we want to get another shade darker. If you have details you want to add that are not super dark, you can add them with the pencil, but you have to have a delicate touch and kind of a soft hand with it. So use it lightly, and you should be able to apply those details as well. When you go into the dark shadows, conversely, you may need to apply a little bit more pressure to get it down. Word of caution with the charcoal pencil, it is much harder to erase than the Vine charcoal. That's why we wait to use it until last, until we're feeling pretty confident about the layout of our drawing, because then we can lay down our charcoal pencil with confidence. If you used your charcoal pencil for your entire drawing, you've probably made quite a mess of it by this point, and you should hopefully learn your lesson and not do that in the future. So you want to start with the Vine until you get everything where you like it, and then you can add the charcoal pencil. All right, so I'm just going to kind of continue through the rest of this. I can add more value and tone like I'm doing here with my Vine charcoal if I notice spots I miss. And then I can use the charcoal pencil to get in any deep shadows or any small details I see. All right, the rest of this process is really just about refinement. So you're just going to kind of go back and forth looking from your drawing to your reference photo and trying to spot the difference. That's really all it is, and then trying to fix the difference as much as you can. This refinement process can last for hours. When you're trying to do a fully refined charcoal drawing, a lot of times it'll take multiple hours to kind of get it to where you're happy with it. We're trying to keep this on kind of a limited timetable today, so we won't worry about getting everything perfect, but I do want you to use the entirety of the time you have to try to get everything as good as you can possibly get it in the allotted time. So you can see I'm just going back in. I'm kind of adding more detail or darkness in the places I need it, trying to observe smaller and smaller details and nuances, trying to catch smaller and smaller problems with the drawing and address them one by one in order of priority. So you can see I'm spotting some more details in the shadows there, adding a little bit more with that charcoal pencil. I'm also maybe catching some value issues and adjusting those with the Vine charcoal, maybe pulling things out, making them lighter with the kneaded eraser. One of the things we really want to strive for in this is to have a good range of values. So we want to have solid, dark areas that are as dark as we can get them. We also want to have areas that are as light as the paper. And we want to have a complete range of values in between. We want to have lots of shadows, lots of midtones, lots of lights and highlights. You can see right here I'm adding in a little crack I spotted. But it's just a matter of kind of working through, looking at them, comparing the two, and making corrections to the drawing as you are able to spot things. All right? So that's the basic process. You can kind of continue to work with your leftover time and refine it as much as you are able to. Alright, so you can pause the video here. This is my finished project. Try to get yours here, or maybe even take it a little bit further if you have the time. And thank you for participating. We'll see you next time on Painting with Rob Boss.